Welcome everybody to another open office hours for the documentation team from the documentation team at Canonical. We have an exciting session planned for today, where Shane is going to talk us through. What are you going to talk us through, Shane?
I'm going to talk about how we document terminal commands.
Which is something that practically everybody has to do.
Yeah, it's something that if you look at software documentation, it's a huge part of what constitutes software documentation, terminal commands.
Okay, well, I invite people to have their questions for Shane ready and in their heads as he takes it away with his groundbreaking and exciting presentation.
Should I start this groundbreaking and exciting presentation?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Why don't you?
Okay, let me try to share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can. Well, I can see it.
Good start.
That's all that matters.
So far, so groundbreaking. So will I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is terminal commands and how we include them in software documentation. And the title of the presentation is 10 Ways to Document Terminal Commands. I think this is some sort of probably famous error that you can make when you're preparing a title for a presentation in advance. I think I probably had 3 or 4 ways in mind when I put 10 in the title. So I think ultimately I found 10 ways, but this presentation, I won't be going through them, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I promise you there are 10 ways in the presentation, and I might make available a list of them afterwards, but you'll have to kind of spot the methods I'm talking about as I do the presentation. So when we talk about a terminal, we're talking about a command line interface that looks something like this. And what it is a way for us to interact with our computer and to get it to do interesting and useful things by entering text into the terminal, pressing enter, and then waiting for a response or an effect to happen in our computer environment. So if we look on the screen here, we've got a basic terminal, and there's some different things that are included here. So if we look at the start, we have this MF Doom fan at Cork City. This is a username and a host name. And then there's also a prompt symbol. And then if we look down at the areas here, we see that there's some underlined text, and the underlined text are commands. And these are the things that do useful stuff when we put them into our terminal. So we have an ls command here, and this will list some files and folders that are in our current working directory. And then we have a command that moves us into one of those directories. We have a command that takes a Python file and runs it. And then we have some useful input that we want to have when we run that command. So in this one example, we see a lot of different things. Okay, I would say that the most important thing that we have for the purpose of this presentation, the most important thing we have in this terminal here is the commands. That's the thing that we're typically trying to capture in our documentation. And one of the amazing things about documenting software is that we can demonstrate a lot of activities and interesting, useful things we can do with our computer just using these text commands. And someone can take these text commands and copy them and put them into their own terminal on their own computer, and they can then have those useful things happen on their own computer. So there's not many, I guess, tasks or activities that exist in the world that you can just get people to copy the text that describes those actions or events, and that they can just paste them somewhere and that the things will happen. You know, you can't do that with DIY or plumbing or gardening. This is something that we can do with software. So this type of command line interface where we put text into a terminal, press enter, and something happens, some output is generated on the screen, for example. This is often described as simple, and this can confuse people maybe who aren't used to using a command line interface, because it looks complicated. If you look at this screen, there's an @ symbol, there's a $ symbol, there's a tilde, you know, there's a lot going on, but ultimately what it boils down to, for all intents and purposes, is some short commands that do useful things. And this type of command line interface appears a lot in documentation at Canonical, for example, because many of the people that use our products are software developers, and software developers often favor this kind of interface over something like a graphical user interface. And there's many reasons for that. One reason is that it's scriptable, so you can automate terminal commands very easily. They can be incorporated into continuous integration pipelines and things like GitHub. So there's lots of advantages of this way of documenting software. An alternative, of course, is a graphical user interface. So this is a small little web-based application that I made a few years ago, and it shows a 3D model, and we can change the color, and we can zoom in, and there's some buttons, and if I hover over the buttons, they change colors, and there's some checkboxes, and when I see the checkboxes, I know that if I click on them, they're likely to do something. And this is a graphical user interface. This is something that's quite different from the command line interface, and it also has certain advantages over the command line interface. So this is something that we might hear referred to as easy. So earlier I said that the terminal is simple, and what I mean by simple is not that everyone should understand how to use it, but that it's composed of a small number of elements. So it's composed of things like text commands and text outputs, right? So we can describe what's in the terminal using a small number of parts. The graphical user interface, on the other hand, has lots of different things going on. It's got a color wheel, it's got buttons, it's got checkboxes, it's got graphics, it's got colors, it's got key bindings that do things like zoom and stuff like that. But what the graphical user interface has is a certain level of intuitiveness. We can look at it and we can say, I know what to do with this button, I know what to do with this checkbox. If I drag my cursor over this model in the middle, something is probably going to happen. So if a graphical user interface is well designed, it can have this easy quality, it can be intuitive, it can be the best type of interface if we're trying to represent something like a 3D model, for example, and we want someone to interact with it. But that's another kind of interface that I'm not going to focus on in this presentation, but it is important to mention. So what we need to do in software documentation is often tell people how to achieve something that they want to achieve in their computer using terminal commands. So these are this is the text that people enter into their terminal to achieve something. And here there's a quote that you might hear if, for example, you're a technical author or technical writer and you're talking to an engineer. They might say something to you very casually, like, just run a make dir cd into the directory, create a hello.py and run the Python interpreter. And this type of statement, you know, it's very conversational, it's very fluid, and that works fine if both people who are having that conversation, you know, have a very good understanding of these types of commands. And how this often appears in documentation is the inline style. So if in most documentation, we write in a markup language like Markdown, for example, and we can surround words in backticks, which is shown here in the title, and this will basically tell whatever converts our Markdown into a web page that this is some code. And usually that then transforms the style of the code as it appears in the final web page. So here, for example, we first make dir test, so make a directory called test, then cd change directory into that directory test. So we are mixing text and inline code for terminal commands. And this in some documentation could appear on multiple lines. So here we're saying make this directory, change into that directory, and then we're echoing a script, a very simple Python script to print hello world. We're echoing that into a file called hello.py, and then we're running the Python interpreter to run that script that we've called hello.py. And this resembles that kind of conversational style that we saw earlier. It mixes natural language and the terminal commands. And this can be very effective for short and well-known commands. So in Canonical, for example, you can mostly assume that if someone is reading your documentation for a relatively complex software product, that they'll know what you mean by something like make dir test. So you can say, make dir test and then cd into test. People will probably understand what you mean. But if you've got long paragraphs that consist of intermingled inline terminal commands and text, it can get very noisy and very, very complicated to read. So that mightn't be desirable from a user experience perspective. So this can get very messy. So what we have as an alternative is we can use tree backticks to surround something, and this creates what we call a code block. And code blocks in documentation generators, like one we use very commonly in Canonical called Sphinx, these code blocks are very configurable. So you can do lots of interesting things with them. So you can write the code block so that they will produce line numbers, for example, if you want to represent some script that a user has to use. You can also write code blocks that will highlight a certain line to draw attention to a specific line in a set of commands. And one of the most useful things is a copy button. So this gets automatically included in code blocks for a lot of documentation generators. So I can click this copy button, and then I can come down to my terminal at the bottom here, and I can paste it in, and I can take that set of terminal commands, put them into this terminal, and I could press enter, and it would run all the commands and do what I wanted to do on my computer. So this is a really convenient way of including terminal commands in documentation, and we use it very commonly. Now, this example here is a very neat and simple one. It actually gets a lot more complex than this, and you can run into a lot of problems using these code blocks. And I'll get onto that more towards the end of the presentation. So I think for the most part, these code blocks are a really good option. They have good accessibility properties. They can be customized very easily. So in general, I think this is a good approach to use. And even if we stick to that approach, we have some obvious choices that we can make. So we could, for example, choose, instead of having one big code block, we could break them up into smaller chunks. And each of these chunks will also have their own copy buttons, so we can copy them as we want. And I think this can be advantageous if we actually can't afford to assume that whoever's reading the documentation understands what all these commands mean. So, for example, it could be very beneficial to whoever's reading this, especially if we're using more complex commands, to say, first make a directory called test, and then show the command. And now change into that directory you just made, cd test. So in this way, you can maybe teach a more early stage user of a product, what the commands mean and what they do, while you're including commands in a copyable way that they can then run in their terminal. So I think from a pedagogical perspective, it can sometimes be advantageous to break up those code blocks. Now, if someone is very experienced reading your documentation, it might be more convenient for them to just take one code block and copy everything and get it running on their computer. They might want you to teach them what each of these commands mean. So it really depends who you expect your user to be. Now, something I see very commonly in our own documentation as well, and this has been something I'm working on, is screenshots of terminals. So this is a terminal which shows the same basic information. So we have the exact same commands that I'm going to be using throughout this presentation. And this is a terminal running on my own computer, and there's some stuff that's different here. We've got a wallpaper in the background. We've got a transparent terminal, so the wallpaper is showing through. We've got an unusual green tint to our terminal. And if we were to include this screenshot in documentation, it could be very distracting, right? We don't want, when someone is reading a documentation, for people to be encountering the personalized style preferences of whoever wrote the documentation when it comes to their terminals. This image is slightly better in some ways and slightly worse in other ways. So here we've cropped out information that's unnecessary, like the wallpaper in the background, for example. We no longer have a transparent terminal, but obviously the aspect ratio is off. So the image hasn't been included in a way that correctly captures the proportions of the terminal. And we also have things like, for example, here we have an unusual break in the line, which makes it difficult to read the command. It's breaking the command across two lines. Now, if you're working on documentation, you're probably working in a team. Each member of the team, has a different setup on their computer probably, and maybe in 10 or 15 years' time, there could be a totally different team working on the documentation. So potentially there's lots of different terminals that people are using, lots of different aesthetics that they prefer in their terminals. So what you probably want, and what I think is very common in Canonical when people take these kinds of screenshots, is you probably want to take an approach like this. So this is a terminal that's running inside a virtual machine. So for example, I have my own personalized terminal on my computer, and I don't want that to show in the documentation. So basically I spin up a virtual machine, and the virtual machine runs Ubuntu, and it's got the default terminal style for Ubuntu. And I can take a screenshot of this, and if everyone on my team agrees to take this approach to screenshots, then our screenshots will be consistent in the team and also in the company. But this process then becomes quite a big one. So instead of just maybe take a screenshot, what we actually mean is something like run a VM, then do all the commands that you need to capture for the tutorial, for example, then take your screenshot, then crop out the unnecessary material. Then you're probably going to want to compress the image to make sure that the file size isn't too big for the documentation. And then you'll also probably want to include some good alt text. So if I highlight this, or if I hover over this image here, there's a tooltip, and it says screenshot of a Hello World program created and run in the terminal. A directory called test is created. We change into that directory, echo the code into a Python file called hello, and then run the program. So if an image like this is included in documentation, and if it contains a lot of text that a user is expected to read, but if a user, for example, is blind and cannot read the text, then you need to include something like alt text in your image definition in the HTML for the website. And this will allow that person to use something like a screen reader to actually interpret what's going on in this image. So if you choose to include an image, you have this kind of process that I guess ideally everyone has to agree on to capture consistent images. And then anytime something changes in your program or in your product, you have to agree to go through this process again in order to maintain that product. So this is something that carries potentially a lot of technical debt. So good and consistent screenshots. Screenshots seem like an easy thing to do. They seem something, anyone can take a screenshot on their computer pretty much, but it actually takes a lot of work to do well and consistently. So an alternative to this, an alternative way of taking a screenshot is to generate images that resemble a screenshot. So there's tools like Carbon, for example, where you can go to a website, you can enter the commands that you want captured in the image into a text box, And then Carbon will automatically generate a really nice high-resolution image of a terminal with the commands being run, and you can customize the theme and things like that. And this is really popular on social media. So when people are sharing images of terminal commands or scripts that they've developed, they often use Carbon to achieve this. And there are some similar tools. Recently, there was a tool called Freeze, developed by Charm Bracelet, which is also another similar way of doing this. And one of the nice things about Carbon and Freeze is that they come with their own command line tooling. So this is something that you could potentially integrate into a continuous deployment pipeline, for example. This could be something that you have plain text definitions of certain commands that you want to include in your documentation, and then you have your Carbon now script automatically being triggered and updating your documentation with relevant terminal images and alt text on a regular basis. So this is an alternative way of capturing that information in image form. Another similar thing then to think about when we're talking about capturing terminal commands in a visual way is the option of a screencast. And this is something you also see sometimes in software documentation, although not very commonly. And the screencast that's being shown here is from YouTube. This is a very famous tutorial for the software Blender, and it's a tutorial about how to make a three-dimensional donut. And this tutorial, I think, has 8 parts. It's watched by a lot of people. And I think the key reason why this is a video tutorial and not a text tutorial is that clearly this is a visual interface. It's a graphical user interface. There's a 3D scene. There's nodes being connected. There's text inputs. It's very difficult to capture this amount of information in a text-based document or just a set of images. This is something that is very effectively captured by a video. And also, the person who's doing this video is a popular internet personality. So this is someone people gravitate to, people know very well. And this person is, in a very sophisticated way, navigating a very complex graphical user interface where there's lots of immediate feedback and lots of things that are moving around. And I guess my question would be, why would we use this medium in the context of terminal commands? Because terminal commands, in comparison to what's going on in this Blender donut tutorial, are much simpler. We only have text. And typically, the person who's documenting the terminal commands, they're probably not a huge internet presence in most cases. The person who's documenting this in a company, for example. So I think in most cases, if you're thinking of doing a video of your terminal commands for your documentation, you really have to ask the question, what features of the video medium are we actually leveraging when we're using it for documenting terminal commands? Because by doing it, you also miss out on some of the other good features that we talked about earlier, like the ability to copy text and put it into your terminal, for example. Now, there are certain things that maybe are beneficial about a video in the sense that all the information of the video is captured in a box. So instead of multiple images that go that you have to traverse vertically down the length of your documentation page, everything is contained in a single rectangle. So maybe an argument is that it's a way of saving space in your documentation, but that's probably not a very compelling argument in most cases. Now, I said that one of the disadvantages of video is that you cannot copy the text from the video. And one tool that people are probably aware of making a video of terminal commands that does allow you to copy the text is ASCII Cinema, right? I think that's how it's pronounced. So this is a really amazing technology where you can play the video and then you can also copy and paste the text. And I think this is a really good option for 2 reasons when it comes to software documentation. One reason is that it produces a source file for the video. So once you create the video, there's actually a file that contains the text that is used to create the video. So it is something that can be version controlled, for example. What I would say about this approach to documenting terminal commands is that it's probably really important to actually tell the person who's reading the documentation that they can copy the text from the video. Because I had actually seen ASCII Cinema videos for several years, and I never knew that I could copy text from the video. I just thought it was a way of hosting videos on a website, and that it was useful in that way. So I think maybe something to consider if you're taking this approach is actually telling people that you can copy from this video. Now, I mentioned version control. So in Canonical, for example, when we're working on documentation, to some extent we adopt a docs as code approach. So we work with programmers, we're embedded in engineering teams. The engineers, when they're writing their code, they use source control or version control. So each version has a certain ID. There's a history of all the different additions that are made to a code base, and we treat the documentation the same way. And in the previous example of the video, I said that it produces a source file, which means that we can theoretically then track changes to that file over the history of a project. But the source file that's produced by ASCII Cinema is actually very convoluted. It's not very human readable. If you look closely, you can make out some things. So this screenshot tree.png, that's the name of the file that's produced. Edubatopic at punctum was the user and host name in the terminal that was being used. Make their test is one of the commands. But this file, it's a little difficult to read. So if someone was reviewing changes, for example, that you were making to this file, it's probably not the most efficient reading experience. An alternative to that, which also produces a video of some terminal commands, is something called VHS. And with VHS, you write a file like this file here, and it has a .tape file extension. And if you look at this just very quickly, you'll see that it's a much cleaner representation of what's happening in the video. So type means we're going to type a command, make their test as our first command. Then we're going to wait 500 milliseconds, I think. Then we're going to press enter, that runs the command. Then we're going to type another command, and so on and so forth. And this produces a GIF that you can then include in your documentation. And this source file is much easier to understand than the previous one, and it's also something that might be easier to modify and maintain during the history of a project. It's something that we can submit PRs for, or submit PRs against, and compare changes and so on. So I think this is an interesting alternative to the ASCII Cinema approach. However, this is just a GIF. We cannot copy the text from the GIF. So that's an area where it has a disadvantage relative to ASCII Cinema. So there's a readable source, and it can be automated. So just like Carbon, VHS is a command line tool, or Carbon has a web-based interface, and it also has a command line interface. VHS is a CLI-based tool. So this is something you could use in a continuous integration and deployment pipeline with GitHub if you wanted to include GIFs of your terminal commands in your documentation. Now, a kind of approach that isn't probably going to be very popular, but I just wanted to show it because I needed to get to 10 different approaches to doing this stuff, is actually embedding an interactive terminal into your documentation, because our documentation much of the time is in the form of a website. So we can leverage things like JavaScript if we want to communicate information or create certain user experiences. So this is a terminal, and it's styled like the Ubuntu terminal. And I can run things like ls, and it'll tell me, well, we have a file in this directory. And then I can check what's in the file. And it says, in this file, we have a script which prints hello world. And then we can run that file, and it does what we want. So you could imagine a kind of sandboxed environment inside in our documentation where someone is allowed to run through commands that they're seeing and they get output without having to set things up on their own computer. Now this is all smoke and mirrors. So this is basically a fake terminal that I have created a very small set of commands that work, but nothing else works. So this is a contrived example. But there are more sophisticated documentation projects, like for the Golang programming language, for example, where they include interactive terminals and REPLs and things like that, so people can learn within the context of the web environment. So what I would say about this approach is that sometimes I think it's useful or interesting to remember that a lot of our documentation is on the web. It's a website, so we can get creative, but should we? We probably shouldn't. Maybe this is too creative. Maybe there isn't a good enough justification for including this kind of interactivity for some of our applications. Okay, just to finish, I started by talking about this really nice property of terminal commands, which is that you can basically include text in a document, someone can copy the text, put it into their computer, and then it achieves something useful or interesting. And I said that this is, I think, something that we take for granted. It's an amazing thing that we can do, that we can say, if you put this text into your computer, something amazing will happen. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make that happen in the most effective and convenient way possible. So this terminal here, or this set of terminal commands, is actually a really complex case that I've been dealing with lately, and there's a lot going on here. So what we have here is we have a prompt, and the prompt has the path that the user is in. It also has a prompt symbol. And then after that, we have a command. And then on the next line, we have another prompt and a command. And if you look at the third line, we have another prompt, but this is a different one. So we have two different kinds of prompts, right? We have, let's say, prompt 1 and prompt 2. And then the last thing I want to draw your attention to is this point here, where we have an output. Okay, so we have a few different things here. We have a prompt, and we have commands, and we have output. And this, as I said, is an example I encountered recently. And the problem with this is, first of all, it's a little hard to read. And second of all, if the user copies this, they just copy everything. So they copy the prompts, they copy the outputs, and they copy the commands. And if you put that into your terminal and you run it, you're probably going to get an error of some kind. So the reason this is so complicated, or one of the reasons this is so complicated, this particular terminal, is that when we're documenting a specific product in Canonical called Ubuntu WSL, we have to take into account that the WSL product, what it is effectively, is a way to run Ubuntu on a Windows machine. And Ubuntu has its own style of prompt and its own particular type of commands in the terminal that's in Ubuntu. Windows has its own different type of terminal with a different prompt and a different set of commands. So one of the challenges that we face with the Ubuntu WSL documentation is that we have to remind the person who's reading the documentation that sometimes they're running a command in the Windows terminal, and sometimes they're running a command in the Ubuntu terminal. And there's a lot of switching between the Windows terminal and the Ubuntu terminal. So that's why we have the prompts, the $sign to say you're now in the Ubuntu terminal, and the PS with the path to say you're now in the Windows terminal. And then also the output is there because, as an engineer I was working with said, the output can be very important as a way for the user to validate that what's happening in their terminal is correct. So that engineer thought it was really important to include the output. So the first thing to say here is that you can include the output in your documentation, but it's probably a good idea to separate the output from the commands. That's the first thing. The second thing is that for lots of documentation, you probably don't need to include the prompt. This is something that causes a lot of heated conversations among people working in documentation, but many times you can just include the command, and that's what will get copied when the user wants to use it. So typically, it's good to separate the command from the output. Oftentimes, you don't need the prompt, but if you are going to include the prompt, there are ways you can actually prevent the prompt getting copied when the user presses a copy button, for example. So what we want to do is we want to include this kind of information, but we don't want everything to be copied. We only want these commands to be copied. We don't want the prompt to be copied because that doesn't actually do anything in our terminal if we paste it, and it probably causes an error. And the second thing is we want to separate out this output. So sometimes, and as I said earlier, code blocks are very customizable in these documentation generators. You can do things like you can use regular expressions, for example, to actually find where in your code blocks there is a prompt. And then you can, this regular expression will basically remove that prompt from anything that's copied. So if we go back to the previous example, if we pressed copy, the regular expression would say, well, this here is a prompt, so we're not going to include that in the material that the user is copying. The second thing that's shown here is some CSS. So CSS is how we style websites. And CSS is what creates this copy button that I've been using in this presentation. And we can say that this copy button should only be included in code blocks that are not that do not contain the class no-copy. So this allows us to put no copy into a code block, and it will say if no copy is in that code block, then we shouldn't have a copy button. So the user will not see a copy button, so they won't have the instinct to then copy that text and put it into their terminal to see if something can happen. And the reason for that is if we're separating the commands from the output, we don't want someone to be confused about which thing is a command and which thing is an output. So it might be a good idea to actually remove copy buttons from outputs of commands that people might run. Because if you think about it, there's very few circumstances in which someone would want to copy the output of a terminal command from documentation. So there's no reason why, if you've got output blocks in your documentation for the user to validate that what's happening on their computer is correct, then you don't necessarily want that user being hinted at when they hover over the code block. You don't want them being hinted at to copy that output, because why would they copy it? So this first one here is a regular expression, and what this does is it allows us to exclude the prompt from any copying that happens. The second is CSS, and this allows us to selectively remove the copy button. And in the documentation generator that we use, Sphinx, you have a configuration file that's written in Python, and basically what you do is you create two variables, and these variables will hold this information, the regular expression and the CSS information. And this allows you then to create bespoke code blocks that maybe solve some of these issues that I was talking about. So to wrap up, commands are simple to document, and I use simple with quotes because I know this can sometimes be patronizing to people. This doesn't mean that, oh, you don't understand how to use a terminal, like you're not a real engineer, you're not a real developer, you're not a real technical author. That's not what it means. I mean something basically that says a command line interface only has text. Typically, it doesn't have buttons, it doesn't have images, it doesn't have audio, it doesn't have all this extra stuff. So it's simple in the sense that it only has a small number of elements. And there's many different ways in documentation that we can represent these terminal commands, and there's trade-offs between these different methods. So it might be, for example, desirable from an aesthetic perspective to include a very high-resolution image of a terminal command or a set of terminal commands, but then you have costs associated with accessibility issues, for example. You might want to include a video that allows you to copy the text, which is really cool, but the source code that's associated with that video is not the most human readable. So there might be some issues with version control and maintenance over time. There are better and worse ways to use each approach. So if you choose to use images, there's better ways to do it. I think images can be effectively used in documentation. I think terminal commands is probably the worst use of images that can be included in documentation because there's better ways to do it. But if you are using images, and maybe there's legitimate reasons, you should try to do it in the best way possible. So that means having a consistent workflow across your team, automating it if possible, and so on. If you're using an unconventional method, I think you need a really good reason. So probably the most unconventional method I would have spoken about in this presentation was the embedded terminal, which is written in jQuery. It's called jQuery terminal. It's something someone created. It allows you to embed a terminal in a website, and it allows you to create your own commands that a user can interact with and generate output. I think that's a really cool idea, but I struggle to imagine a good way of justifying the inclusion of that to my team, for example. So that's something to be aware of and to think about its potential, but I think it might be difficult to justify its inclusion over the more reliable methods. So lastly, I think it's important when we're talking about terminal commands and their documentation to think about functionality. So what does it actually do? So this is like code blocks, for example. If your code blocks contain copy buttons, what is actually being copied when someone clicks the copy button? Because if you have a copy button, the selling point is that, whoa, someone can copy this stuff and just put it right into their terminal, and it will do what we tell them it will do. But if the copy button is also copying a bunch of junk, and then the person puts it in their terminal and they get errors, it's not functioning as it should. It looks like it's functioning, but it's not. Accessibility, again, if you're talking about images, I think images, especially that contain a lot of text, that's a big accessibility issue, and you need to think about how to include things like alt text. And then maintainability. And again, I would talk about images there. If you're expecting someone to run a virtual machine, crop their images, compress their images, include alt text, you're introducing a lot of work that people are going to have to continuously do over a long time, and this introduces a maintenance issue. So that's it for me. I hope it was somewhat interesting.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. I'm sure everyone got something out of that. There were lots of new things and exciting alternatives for presenting text on screen there. Well, I'm sure some people are going to have some questions while they're thinking them up, and
I'm happy. I'm certainly not an expert in any of this. Some of this stuff is new to me too. So if any of the other if anyone else who's really knowledgeable about terminal commands or documentation in general wants to jump in and save me at any point, they're welcome to.
I was going to add a small nugget of information that is a kind of quirkily interesting thing. At Canonical, we used to, when we did screenshots of the desktop with a terminal in it or with something else in it, the time was always set to whatever the latest release was. So if you were doing a screenshot of Bionic, for example, the time would be 4 minutes past 6. It'd be 1804, and that was a real pain and took extra effort. Now we don't have to do it because we've gone past where you can make the clock say those things. Cool. So I actually have a question about the input and output. When you suggested splitting up inputs and outputs, and that makes sense because one thing is the part that the user is going to have to put in, and one thing is what they're going to expect to get out. When you separate them, do you tend to put an explanation or something in between? Or
yeah, I think that's that's probably essential unless you have some sort of visual clue. So yeah, you run the following script, and then you have a code block that has the command that's going to be run, and then you have a separate sentence that says this should produce the following output, or something like that. Now, the issue that you can run into is if you have, if you have input, output, input, output, input, output, input, output, you kind of end up with a writing challenge of not just saying this should produce the following output every single time. So yeah, I think you have to flag in text that this is an output, unless you have, there's other ways you could have a terminal that has some, or you could have a code block that has some styling that says, output, or command output written in a header or something like that. The LexD documentation in Canonical uses a Sphinx extension where how the output is rendered is there's a code block which includes the command that generated the output. So you have the line that has the command and then the output, and then you have no copy button. So this is kind of a signifier that, like, okay, this is a command that generates an output, but there's no copy button. But the other code blocks in the LexD documentation do have copy buttons, the ones that just have commands. Now, the other question that came up about outputs, I actually originally said maybe I was feeling particularly emphatic on this day. I said to my engineers, we should have no outputs. I said there should be no outputs in the documentation, because the valuable piece of information is the command. The user is going to see the output on their computer. Why would we also include the output here, especially if it's very, very long? And the engineer said, well, they need to check that what they're seeing is right. Now, I still think that that's one of those interesting conversations that might happen between a technical author and an engineer, which is, if something goes wrong in the user's terminal, should that be clearly signified? Should it be explained to them in their own terminal, rather than them having to kind of revert back to the documentation where it says, if you see something like this error, this means that X has gone wrong. Should the actual log, the error log that is produced in the terminal, should that actually explain? Should that be the documentation that explains the output, rather than having the output also included in the documentation?
Sure. Also, I guess sometimes, and I think probably LexD is a good example of this, though, the output includes unique information which the user then requires as an input for some later commands.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to describe the expected output in some way that people can extract that information from.
Yeah, or maybe if there's a command that's going to be, in the Unix style, if there's a command that's going to be piped into another command, or composed with a set of commands, then maybe it's useful to say, like, this command produces this output, and if we pipe it into this command, it will produce this further output. Like, if you're going to start composing or piping things together, it can be very informative to say this is the output that we're piping into this next thing.
Sure. Okay. Cool. Does anyone else have any questions that they want to ask before I stop the recording?
So someone is saying there that Iqbal is saying that terminal outputs can be really helpful in documentation. I totally agree. I guess my problem is when someone includes an output that's, 2 pages long, and it's just like it's really difficult to understand. I don't think that helps anyone. It makes it more difficult to read the documentation. It makes it more forbidding, and you also it's difficult to read the information, and it just distracts you from the other things that you need to be doing. So I think in that case, to answer your question, the rule of thumb, I think what's very common is that people truncate the output. So especially if it's just a bunch of boilerplate, like if you run the following command, you will be shown all of the background processes that are running on your computer, and there's 100 of them, but you could just show 3 of them, and ... the 100 one. Like, there's no reason to show people 100 services that are going to be running on their computer, because they shouldn't have to check all of them validate them against your own machine. So I think if you're including the output, you have to also consider some of the possible implications for the readability of the documentation itself. If a beginner is trying to run some commands to do something useful, they don't want to be reading a 2-page log file. Another alternative maybe is to have an optional drop-down. So like, if you click an arrow, it will show you the output if you want to see it. But yeah, so output is really helpful, I agree, but you have to be careful. And Iqbal, I think, is saying that the Rust documentation, which I actually think, I find Rust very difficult, but I think its documentation is actually really nicely done.
One other quick thing we run into in the MAS team is that we have every single CLI command has a replaceable parameter equal to your profile name. And that varies for everybody. Is it admin? Is it Bob? Is it Steve? And we just put $profile in there. Of course, they click it, try to run it, and they get nothing, and they can't figure out why, and then they have to go. So we haven't come up with a good way to tell them. So if anybody has any good ideas on how to do this, because it's built in, it's baked into the CLI. It's not great. You should have a way to set it to begin with, so you don't have to keep repeating it, but we've never done that. So if anybody has great ideas on how we deal with this, not necessarily right now, but please volunteer them.
Yeah. So Simon is asking, from an accessibility perspective, do you have a set of guidelines you tend to follow for alt text? And Nick sent a link, but I just think for terminal, for images of like, an image with 10 terminal commands and 10 outputs, that's such an accessibility challenge, because I don't think you can have alt text that's like all of that information. So I think images are a bad way of representing this type of information if there's a lot of it.
Yeah, I haven't checked whether like what does a screen reader do with ASCII Cinema, for example? Can it read it out, or does it read out the source, which would be unintelligible gibberish?
Good question. I'm not sure.
Cool.
Yeah, with all these options, like the video, the images, like that alt text aspect is something definitely to consider.
Okay, well, thanks once again. It was indeed a great presentation. It covered a lot of stuff. I'm sure provoked a lot of thoughts in the brains of the people who were here and who will watch it afterwards. I'm going to stop the recording now. If anyone has anything else they want to say, they can say it now, I guess.